Welcome back, everyone, to session 2. I'll just hold this out. To session 2 of our conference. I'm Scott Paul. I serve as the executive director here at the Center for Constitutional Studies. And on behalf of the center, welcome to this session of the conference, of our 23rd annual Constitution Day conference here at Utah Valley University. Just some quick housekeeping items. First, if you're here for CLE credit, you'll just need to sign up on the CLE list at the registration table outside to make sure you get your credit with Utah Bar. Second, if you're a student and you need to leave for class, just leave quietly. The ideal time to do that would be between the transition from presentations to Q&A. That'll be in about 45 minutes. Third, in this session, you will hear from current and past UVU students, all of whom are Eric Zachary Wood Student Research Assistants here in the Center for Constitutional Studies. We would not have the privilege of working with these students, with these amazing students, if it weren't for the generosity of Brian and Angela Wood. Brian and Angela, we can't thank you enough. And finally, the Center for Constitutional Studies and Utah Valley University thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, especially the Office of Digital Humanities, for making this conference possible through the Digital Humanities Advancement Grant Program. We're deeply grateful for this opportunity, and we applaud and join with the NEH as it pursues its mission to, quote, serve and strengthen our republic by promoting excellence in the humanities and conveying the lessons to history to all Americans, close quote. What a great mission. Let's see. This session is entitled "Elections and Suffrage in Western State Constitutions," and we will hear first from Dr. Nicholas Cole, who comes to us from Pembroke College at the University of Oxford, where he is a senior research fellow, and he is also the director of the Quill project, which he will tell us a little bit about. Well, a lot about. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cole.
Thank you, Scott. So the students are going to talk about some more specific issues, and I just want to give you an overview of the methodology of the broader project that they've been working on. There are really only two ways to write a constitutional text. You can ask one very clever individual to write your constitutional text, or, and this became much more common after the 18th century, following the American model, you can have a convention process to write a constitutional text. And the broader project of which this is part is really an effort to take seriously that second idea and to really better understand the way in which those processes of collective authorship have worked across time. It turns out they're very difficult to study. It's often much easier to imagine that a single individual is responsible for a text, because we find it easier to get a handle on that as human beings, I think. And so when one of the early states was thinking about a monument to put in its state capital, it commissioned a statue of George Washington, who looks very much like a Roman lawgiver in the picture on the left. And I'm pleased to say that you can't go and see that statue because it was, shortly after it was installed in the 1820s, struck by lightning. So I take that as a sign that studying these more difficult processes is the way forward. By the end of the 19th century, when all of the Western states that we're thinking about in this conference wrote their constitutions, the idea of an orderly process for managing debate in a wide variety of settings had really taken root in American culture. There were lots of manuals that purported to describe how legislative assemblies should work, and those same manuals often said, well, these rules apply in almost any setting of collective human endeavor. So in fact, many of the same manuals marketed themselves in the 19th century as a way for managing the process at your state constitutional convention, if you were going to hold one, but also for boardrooms, for societies, for other parts of civic life. And it was part of the school curriculum. It was taught in classrooms how to engage in these formal processes of debate in a way that I think has become quite lost to us in recent decades. Understanding how a text is negotiated is difficult. The nature of the records of these kinds of processes that often spanned months and even years in a few cases is complicated and intricate and difficult even for the people in the room to understand sometimes, and they have to ask a lot of questions of the secretariats that are facilitating their debates. But it becomes even more challenging for people later to make sense of these processes, because the records that are left are simply not designed to help you do that, and are often published for reasons of memorialization more than to assist with historical investigation. And lastly, the state records that do exist that chart these processes have not had the attention that has been given to federal records. We stand, I think, and I don't think I'm in much danger of too much contradiction, pretty much in the same state as regard to our understanding of how state constitutional texts came into existence. We stand now at about the same point that we did with regard to the federal constitution in about 1890. In other words, we know that there is a lot in the archives. We know that there is a lot of material that could be pulled together. Some of it has been published, often in very imperfect editions and for reasons that are suspect. But the kind of detailed editorial work, let alone the second and third order efforts of analysis, have simply not been done. Why might it be interesting to think about state constitutional texts and the processes of their creation? Well, for lawyers, there's an obvious payoff. If you're into particular methods of interpretation, original intent, if that is the interpretive method that you prefer. But for the rest of us, I think there is a broader question that we need to wrestle with as well. How have democratic institutions come into being? How have institutions been built? What are the implications for fields beyond history, such as for peace studies in the modern world? What are the social, political, and economic debates that are captured by debates over fundamental law? There's a bit of frustration sometimes from lawyers that people want to put too much into state constitutional texts. We heard a little bit of that this morning. Surely some of this should be legislation. They say, well, maybe. But it turns out that when the American public, when publics around the world are given the opportunity to write fundamental law, they often want to write a lot into those texts that goes far beyond simply institutional design. And we should take those debates seriously. There's an opportunity in America to think about how constitutional language has evolved across time and place, and also about how process has evolved across time and place. How have different constitutional conventions at state level behaved? Have all of them behaved in similar ways, or have they behaved in different ways? And I think we should think about all of these questions in the context of global, certainly, yes, even locally in our own countries, growing distrust of democratic institutions and the rule of law. People think, they like to say, that the game has been rigged. Well, maybe understanding the history of those institutions is a good place to start, whether you think they need reform or whether you think they need better trust. We've already heard this morning that American constitutional law as a whole is much less stable than people imagine. The federal constitutional text has been incredibly stable, even if interpretation of it has not been. but the state-level constitutions have been rewritten incredibly frequently, and I've put some statistics up on the slide. They have been rewritten by formal state constitutional conventions, and they have also been rewritten through amendment processes of different types. It's very hard to know exactly how to count sometimes, but by my count there have been about 230 to 35 separate constitutional texts at state level written by conventions that had the power to rewrite any language at all. So what about the project that the students are going to talk about? Well, in 2019, Utah Valley University applied for a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities to look at constitution writing in the American West. That was an interesting choice of topic. They did not make a beeline for founding era state constitutional conventions. They decided to take seriously the fact that maybe there was something different about the American West that was worthy of study. That the Western state constitutions, if you like, deserved first-class treatment. And they won that grant, first time round. And I think it was the first grant that UVU has ever applied for to the National Endowment of the Humanities. It is incredibly unusual for any university to win a large grant on the first try. In fact, I remember saying to colleagues here when we wrote the grant together, you mustn't be disappointed if this gets kicked back the first time round. We'll try again, because that's normally how these things work. But they not only won it on the first attempt, but they won it at a level that was, I think, the 5th largest award ever made in the program that they were applying to. So it was a remarkable achievement. And I just want to pay tribute to the fact that that achievement was possible because of the work of some people who are not here. Rod Smith, who was the director of the Center for Constitutional Studies at the time, really thought that UVU should be ambitious and should try and win this grant at an early stage, when we were still working out many of the methodologies that we used in the project. And also, a previous generation of UVU students had done incredibly diligent work on the Utah state constitutional records, which served as a test case for the work that we wanted to do more broadly on Western state constitution writing. They had been into state archives, they had looked at newspaper records, they had really shown that we knew what we were getting into if we said, well, we want to study the records of constitution writing in Western states. And without all of that work, and without Rod's vision, I don't think this project would have started. I won't go through the details of the digital platform. You can explore that online, and I hope you will. Suffice it to say that we have tried to lay out the process of debate and decision-making in state conventions in a way that is more intelligible than simply trying to read the records themselves. We try to put you, as nearly as we possibly can, in the room where these debates take place. If you like, this is a sort of track changes on steroids for historians and lawyers and other people. And I'm grateful to colleagues at the University of London for working on some really incredible and cutting-edge visualizations for us as part of the project as well. We try and show you, in a way, what was the text when particular decisions were made? How did a particular clause get to be included or not included in the text? We try and give you easy access then to all of the primary sources that you might need if you want to investigate this further. And as the years go on, I'm sure there will be more and more annotation throughout the platform as well to help you understand the records. So think of these as live and interactive digital editions. What are the sorts of payoffs? I want to just show you my favorite one, and then I'm going to turn it over to the students to talk through some of the substantive issues that are raised in the collections that we're publishing as part of this project. If you just read the modern Constitution of Wyoming, you would see that they have quite a standard provision in their Bill of Rights: no person shall be deprived of his life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That's language that is taken from the 14th Amendment, and you might think there is absolutely nothing remarkable about that language at all. Of course it makes sense that a state should just simply copy the language of the federal constitutional text. And yet, this language was only proposed on the third to last day of substantive debate at the Wyoming Convention. There was a motion made: I desire to substitute for Section 6, no person shall be deprived of his life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the person moving that amendment said that his motive was because the previous language had just been robbed of its most important provision. So if you have the sort of, pedantic mind that some of us do, you want to know, well, what did they replace? And what they replaced, what had been the language that would have ended up in the Wyoming draft, except for that moment, was this: no person shall be taken or imprisoned or disseized of his freeholds, liberties, or privileges, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his life, liberty, or property, but by judgment of his peers and the law of the land. But that's not the full story either, because we know that something had happened to this text that had robbed it of its meaning. And what had happened to that text the previous evening was that somebody had moved an amendment to strike out another clause which is even more archaic: or in any manner destroyed. So until 4 days before the end of the state convention, the text in the Bill of Rights would have read: no person shall be taken or imprisoned or disseized of his freeholds, liberties, or privileges, or outlawed or exiled, or in any manner destroyed, or deprived of life, liberty, or property, but by judgment of his peers and the law of the land. This is incredibly archaic language to nearly make it into a state constitutional text at the end of the 19th century. Where's it from? I can say this because Pembroke has Blackstone's undergraduate Latin prose composition essays. This is William Blackstone's bad translation of Magna Carta that was probably available to the Wyoming Convention because they had read Eliot's Debates, which was a compilation of debates from the founding. And this was language proposed by the Virginian ratifying convention for a federal Bill of Rights. So there is a 100-year-long story about that language that would be entirely hidden from you if you just focused on the final text of the Constitution. This project has involved archival work. The students from UVU have been crisscrossing the West looking at state archives. It's involved digitization, transcription, the construction of the complex digital editions that we do. It's involved building better tools for analysis, which I've done in conjunction with colleagues at King's College London. And it's involved rethinking our user interfaces to make them more accessible for teachers, and that work's been done very largely through summer classes at UVU for high school teachers that have given us a lot of feedback on the user interface that we've been developing. We've had to rethink the data model. Turns out state constitutional conventions are much more complicated by and large than the federal convention. We've had to rethink how we visualize particular moments. We've had to think about information discovery. How do different users want to find different pieces of information in this platform? What does it mean to do a search in a collection that is about a constantly evolving text, for example? And we've worked hard to make sure that the processes for editing and checking the work done by the research teams is correct and efficient. And I think this is not only one of the most ambitious projects in digital humanities at the moment, but it's also one of the ones that has moved at the fastest speed. And that's a testament to a lot of work done by the students here and a lot of work that's been done to really get our processes right. All of which was the reason why the Digital Advancement Grant was awarded, because the National Endowment for the Humanities wanted us to think through processes just like this. So this has been a fantastic collaboration on this specific grant. It's part of a much broader and ongoing collaboration between Oxford and UVU that I hope will persist for years and decades to come. There is a lot of work left to do. I want to say one last thing before I hand it over to the students, and that's on the question of assigning blame. If you think, as you look at these collections and maybe use them for different purposes, and we already know that people making arguments to state courts have used some of our collections, if you think that you are relying on careful, diligent, well-edited archival materials, all of the credit for that should go to the student teams and the documentary editing team that we have at Oxford. They really have worked tirelessly to solve many problems, find sources that we thought were lost, and really do the most accurate job possible. If you decide that the overall presentation is clunky and less than ideal, and you have queries about the methodology, all of that blame should come to me, please. And with that, thank you all very much.
Awesome. Good morning, everybody. I'm happy to be here with you today, and I just like to start by saying how grateful I am to my friends up here for doing this with me, and I'm just really excited to get this thing rolling. So I'm gonna go ahead and skip these first couple slides because they're about the NEH grant. We are extremely lucky to have gotten the NEH grant to have the opportunity to pursue this project that we've been working on. As for suffrage in the Western states, we're going to start out with South Dakota and Article 7, titled Elections and Rights of Suffrage. The clause that was originally in the South Dakota article starts by saying that the legislature at the first admission of the state, will then decide on the question of suffrage for women. And it's not until after they become a state. In no way does this amendment ensure women's, like the right to suffrage for women in South Dakota. If anything, it postpones it even further than it should have been. And I mean, I'm not one to judge. I'm really good at procrastinating, but I feel like this might be a little bit too important for that. However, what was given to women, Section 9 of the same article, says that they are allowed to vote in elections held solely for school purposes. And then headed over to North Dakota. North Dakota has a lot more on the has a lot more debate on the question of suffrage. And so they start by asking, you know, who should get to vote? Like, who decides who gets to vote? Is it a natural right that every human has as being, you know, just as being alive? Or is it a right that the government gives to the people as a part of citizenship? And this is the question that Mr. Marr asked midway through their debates on this section. And so the section in North Dakota, it says the same thing, that not until after the territory becomes a state will they decide on the question of suffrage. But this section was it got a lot more backlash than the section in South Dakota, because not because of the question of suffrage itself, but because of how they wanted to decide who gets to decide that. And so Mr. Pollock here, he's saying that he hopes this amendment will not prevail for the reason that the question of extending the right to suffrage of suffrage to women, making that right equal with men, is one that is being considered by the people not only of this territory, but by all the people of the United States. It is a question on which considerable advancement may be made by us, and it is a question that can safely be trusted to the legislature. So basically, what he's saying, he does not want women's suffrage to be a state issue. He thinks that because it is a national issue, which it was at the time, everybody was talking about this, he thinks that it should be turned over to the national legislature instead of the states itself. And with that, I'm going to turn over to Joseph to start our next state.
Perfect. So, maybe perfect. That thing's sliding. So I'm going to talk about Wyoming for a little bit. And certainly Wyoming is what we think about when we think about suffrage. And they're very, very, very proud of the fact that 20 years before the convention, women had been voting in Wyoming. The thing is that's just a law that the legislature made. And so the same thing happened in New Jersey in 1776. Women were voting in 1776, but 3 decades later, the legislature took away that privilege. So that shows the difference between something that the legislature makes and a constitutional provision. The legislature can get rid of a law, but a constitutional provision, you have to have a constitutional amendment to remove that. So Wyoming, that was their goal. They wanted suffrage to be in their constitution. And it's worth noting that the minute they really start discussing suffrage as a quorum, there's a Mr. Campbell who motions to remove that passage from the Constitution. Not because he was opposed to suffrage necessarily, but so that the convention can present it as a separate matter for the citizens of Wyoming to vote on. His main fear is that the people of Wyoming would reject the Constitution that they made because suffrage is a part of it, and thus they would have to start all over again. He said the legislature that passed this law granting suffrage to women scarcely considered the matter at all, were surprised when it passed and when the governor signed the act. It was introduced more as a joke than anything else, and at no time was it seriously considered. And so for this reason, his argument is it's only right to give citizens the chance to vote on the topic themselves. And while few supported his approach, most were against it. A couple of people rejected the rumor that Campbell shared that suffrage in Wyoming was just a joke. Notably, the former governor of the territory, Mr. Hoyt, said, "I sincerely regret the occasion for any discussion on this question. I had assumed that a principle so firmly established and a practice so honorable to the people of this territory, and so long in existence, and so long continued to the satisfaction of all, would have the unanimous approval of a body of men so intelligent, so high-minded, so liberal as those who compose this convention." So many of the debates were similar in this nature. Removing women's suffrage from the Constitution lost. Only 8 voted for it, and 20 were against it. And when they started discussing this section, as you can see, the section says the rights of the citizens of the state of Wyoming to vote and hold office shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. Both male and female citizens of this state shall equally enjoy all civil, political, and religious rights and privileges. That second sentence, the one that's highlighted in blue, was not included when they were first discussing it. The purpose of this inclusion was the result of a Mr. Palmer, who was a particularly outspoken objector to women's suffrage. After the delegates approved that first sentence, Mr. Palmer proposed an amendment to Section 2 here, which originally read, "Every citizen of the United States of the age of 21 and upwards shall be entitled to vote at such an election." His amendment simply added the word male to that. So they had already adopted the first part, and that the second part he inserts the word male, and everyone was like, that's a total contradiction. That doesn't make any sense. And so that second sentence you see there in Section 1 was added to the first section to kind of as a double down that this is for both men and women, and the amendments on Section 2 had failed. One other thing that's interesting that Quill shows us, Article 6 of this very same section had a literacy test, as you can see, Section 9, "No person shall have the right to vote who shall not be able to read the Constitution of the state." So this section brought more discussion and controversy to the convention, and by this test being an official part of that article, this put a handful of delegates in a kind of a voting conundrum. It kind of encapsulates one of the most fascinating themes in American constitutional history, and that is of compromises. If certain delegates favored allowing women to vote, but opposed refusing illiterate people to vote, they had to decide how they were going to vote on this suffrage article. And so you see them kind of like bargaining in their heads, reaching the decision, and you see that through what they're saying as they make these votes. So, Mr. Campbell, "I merely wish to say again that I must protest against this educational qualification, which I believe is all wrong, but inasmuch as this file contains so much good, I vote aye." So he voted for it, even though he was against the literacy test. He voted aye. But then you see Mr. Preston, "Section 9 will deprive some citizens of the United States that intend to move to Wyoming of having an equal voice in the affairs of this country. I vote no." So he voted against that. Mr. Palmer, who I'd mentioned, the outspoken, he was against women's suffrage. He still voted for it. "I am opposed to women's suffrage, but there is so much good in that bill that I vote aye." So at the end, the suffrage article was adopted into the Constitution on a vote of 30 to 12. I will just speak briefly on Idaho as well. Idaho, as you can see, what they introduced is every male citizen of the United States 21 years old is a qualified elector. Until otherwise provided by the legislature, women who have the qualifications prescribed in this article may continue to hold such school offices and vote at school elections as provided by the laws of Idaho Territory. That seemed to be pretty common, where men were given the right to vote in any election, and maybe as what in their minds was thinking of as a compromise, women could vote in school elections. That's their that's what they'll get to do. And so when we see here in this Section 2 where it says that otherwise provided by the legislature, you can kind of see that it appears to be preparing the legislature to allow women's suffrage in the future with that phrase, "until otherwise provided by the legislature." The second this is introduced, every male citizen of the United States, we see multiple attempts to remove that word male. Mr. King, who's a delegate, he states when he proposed his amendment, "I am in favor of allowing the largest liberty to every citizen of the United States, and I firmly believe that a majority of the women of this territory, or in any state of the Union, are just as well qualified for the right of suffrage as the average man. And there are thousands of women 10,000 times better qualified than 1/2 of the men that vote in these United States." All these amendments failed. The word male at the end was a part of their constitution. One thing that I want to point out too is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. They were a group advocating for women's suffrage and prohibition, and they frequently worked with the members of the convention. They sent this petition to them. Idaho's Women's Christian Temperance Union requests and earnestly pray you first that in the Constitution to be proposed to the citizens of Idaho for their approval or rejection, no discrimination on account of sex shall be made, but citizens of both sexes possessing the necessary qualifications shall be equally eligible as electors. After this, after the petition, this was the comments that appeared afterwards. The chair said, any other lady who desires to address the convention in this behalf, a lady stands up. I want to ask and invite the convention to an ice cream social prepared by our Young Women's Christian Temperance Union in our reading rooms. The chair says, the chair takes occasion to inform the ladies who have presented this petition and memorial that the same will receive proper attention and justice will no doubt be done to the ice cream. Which is, it's a funny comment, but I also as you read along the proceedings, you get kind of the vibe that this wasn't necessarily. Some of the suffragettes may have felt like the convention wasn't taking them seriously, and you find that in the comments of Abigail Scott Dunaway. She was a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. She had traveled to multiple state conventions advocating for suffrage. A number of days after the union sent their petition and the ice cream socials happened, Dunaway gave a speech to the whole convention. It lasts about 10 pages long. I argue it's some of the best writings on suffrage and all the projects that I worked on. Her speech is a call for immediate action. She criticized the ice cream socials in her speech. She said that it was an attempt for women to spend their time, quote, running to ice cream festivals to induce men to fill their stomachs with an indigestible compound for consideration. There's also, I just want to read some of her speech too, because I think it's really good stuff. She says here, I know how persistently your wives, kind diplomats, persuade you to believe that you are the supreme power in the household. Your vanity and self-love are fed upon this sophistry, and I do not wonder that you like it. Perhaps if the tables had been turned these 6,000 years, we would have been equally blind in the same direction. You, like us, are very human, and we, like you, are by no means perfect. We know every one of your threadbare arguments against our liberties by heart. You say we must fight if we vote, forgetting or pretending to forget that life's hardest battles everywhere are fought by the mothers of men in giving existence to the race. You say we do not wish to vote when all the opportunities we have ever had to vote have been as freely utilized in that direction as your own. You say if we wish the ballot, let us ask for it, when we have been asking for it for, lo, these 40 years. And so we see here this call, this call of like immediate action. This is something that may have been perceived to the delegates as something as kind of a new idea, when really these women have been advocating for these things much longer than maybe the delegates have in their heads. And with that, I'll turn over to Liné here.
Okay, so my name is Liné, and I'll do the portion on Washington. So provided on the slide, I have Section 1 of Article 6 of the Constitution in its original state before it received any amendments. And it read that all male persons of the age of 21 years or over possessing the following qualifications shall be entitled to vote at all elections. They shall be the citizens of the United States, provided that Indians not taxed shall never be allowed the elective franchise, provided further that all male persons who at the time of the adoption of this Constitution are qualified electors of this territory shall be electors. So I'm sure you guys can see that it was very clear that you had to be a male to vote. So funny enough, the first amendment made to the section was one in favor of granting women's suffrage. And this amendment was made by Mr. Aldrich to strike the word male from the section. And this would have granted suffrage to the women that met the same qualifications for male voters. As you guys can see, Mr. Aldrich was the only one to comment on his amendment. There was no opposing views offered. And in his debate for suffrage, he called for democracy, and he also told the delegates that they should live up to the pledges for women's suffrage. Unfortunately, this motion was lost by an overwhelming majority. Although his amendment got struck, we still have evidence from other delegates who were in favor of women's suffrage. For example, right after Mr. Aldrich's amendment, Mr. Hicks tried to move the same amendment just through a different form. And so his amendment would have had the same effect as Mr. Aldrich, which was granting suffrage to women who had the same qualifications as men. Unfortunately, his motion was also struck down. So this was the content of Section 1 once it got adopted, and the only difference between this and its original form was the amendment added at the end by Mr. Griffiths. And so, according to Section 1's adopted form, they had no success in granting women's suffrage. Even though they weren't successful in Section 1, they still tried to find a way around it, almost by slipping it into the Constitution. And one of the attempts they made was to amend Section 2 that was centered around elective franchise at school elections. And so in Section 2, Mr. Dunbar made an amendment to strike out the words "at any school election." And even though this section wasn't related to the qualifications of a voter, such as in Section 1, if this amendment did pass, it would have forced the question of women's suffrage to be discussed in the legislature. And thus, it would have given the legislature the opportunity to grant women's suffrage. So this amendment by Mr. Dunbar stirred up a debate. And those who were in favor of it, they said the following. So Mr. Dunbar said that he personally favored women's suffrage, but when voting in a representative capacity, he had to vote against it. He would prefer leaving the entire question to the legislator. So Cosgrove took exactly the same ground. He believed that the Constitution would be defeated if women's suffrage were in it, but he was willing to leave it to the legislator. So Proser and Eisenman said that they would support any effort given to women to vote. And Henry preferred to have it in the Constitution, but favored that this amendment is better than nothing. And then those who were against it, they said the following. So Turner said that this idea should be left to the people of the state who determine the question rather than the legislator. And Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Moore also took the same stance and said it should be submitted to the people. And Mr. Stiles thought that if the legislator could fix this one qualification for voting, it should be allowed to do so in all cases, which might, he said, result in idiots being allowed to vote. Gardman and Lillis also opposed it, saying that if the question was left unsettled, it would be brought up at every session and therefore it would be a constant source of trouble. So unfortunately, this amendment was also lost 38-18. And now I will hand it over to Grace just to talk about what the results were of each state.
Thanks, Ms. No, you're... Just real quick, so we can wrap up. The focus of our presentation today was more on the debates, but we felt that it would be a little bit of a disservice if we didn't tell you how it ended, because I hate cliffhangers. So the results in South Dakota. Like I said, South Dakota did not do much debating, and they didn't really change. They didn't change the section that they proposed at all. And so this original section that they proposed at the beginning of the article made it into the Constitution. North Dakota, they switched around their wording a lot. North Dakota did end up passing women's suffrage, where it says suffrage will be extended to everyone without regard to sex. Wyoming is known for its for women's suffrage, and the importance of Wyoming doing this early on is that they kind of set the precedent for the rest of the states in the United States. Washington was not successful in the convention to pass women's suffrage, but eventually in 1910 they created an amendment to their constitution where it did allow for women's right to vote. And then finally in Idaho, only men could vote except in school elections, and in 1896 they passed an amendment also granting women the right to vote.
I think we wanted to just take a specific issue and walk you through it to show how 5 different states were looking at the same issue at the same time. There are some themes to draw across that. One is you see some debates being repeated at different states. You see attention being paid to language being considered at different state constitutional conventions. You also see questions of federalism creeping in. Is this the right kind of thing to be decided at state level? You see interesting debates about whether a particular determination should be made by a constitutional convention or the legislature, even on the question of who are citizens with the right to vote, for example. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of similar issues in the collections that the students have built. But we thought this question of suffrage opened up many of the themes of this conference, and I'm really grateful to you all for presenting it. With that, I think we have time for questions.
So you talked a lot about the debates, and I was just wondering how is there evidence in the debates that these conventions, like the members debating in these conventions, were actively looking at the debates of other conventions or similar arguments that were made? Or because I imagine they did borrow constitutional language across, but was there evidence that they looked at other arguments made across different states?
There we go. Short answer, yes. I should just leave it like that. How would that be? Like we had mentioned, Wyoming was set a precedent for the other conventions. But there's also something that we saw is conversations between constitutional conventions. So there would be a resolution that was passed, and that would be sent to another state, kind of as a welcome. But also sometimes we see that there is the addressing each other and talking to each other about the things that they're working on. So I think they were aware of, and plus Wyoming had suffrage for 20 years, so they were aware of that. I don't know how much of a how much there was of that communication. Obviously, some states had a suffrage and some states did not. But I think it came down to just the kinds of arguments that the delegates were making and how they worded those documents or those arguments. Whether it was, like we had mentioned, we're convincing you to make this an argument, something to have the people vote on, or we're going to have this be something that the legislature is going to work on later. They had these certain ways of communicating that convinced the other delegates. So they all kind of started at this place where this is happening. This is a movement that's happening in the United States. And so it's interesting to see that they kind of went to different places in the end.
I think it's also worth remembering that unlike the federal convention, all of these state conventions were very public and often covered by the press. often in incredible amounts of detail. And so, and news travels in America quickly. And so, you know, when you've got, in certain states, almost day-by-day detailed accounts of proceedings, there's a very easy mechanism, even beyond any formal messages that may or may not be passed backwards and forwards between state conventions, for delegates at conventions to be aware of what is going on elsewhere. And the interesting thing about this particular group of states is that they did understand themselves to be part of the same constitutional process. They're all holding state constitutional conventions within a very sort of limited period of time. They understand this is important for the American West. They are, in a sense, framing the sort of constitutional arrangements for a very large area of territory indeed, and they're aware of each other's work at that level. Another question, if there is one.
I think it's quite obvious that the usefulness of something like the Quill Project for scholars, history and political science, for legislators, for lawyers, judges, etc. I'm curious from the student's perspective, you know, as teacher, as we think about using Quill with our students, how has your understanding of suffrage changed because of this study that you were able to do, this focused study? Impact on your thoughts personally about it. In other words, I could have just told you the results and you would have known what happened in those states. How did understanding the process of how it got there impact you as students?
So when I did Washington, I kind of went in with the mindset that the majority of people who are against women's suffrage, because everyone knows, according to the results, that only in 1910 were women allowed to vote. But when I actually worked with Washington and I looked at the debates, I realized that there were a lot of delegates fighting for women's suffrage. And like when I spoke about Washington, the one delegate made an amendment, it like got struck down, and then another delegate made the same amendment. It also got struck down, and it just continued fighting for it. And if it wasn't for the Quill Project, I would not have known of those delegates who were in favor of it and fighting for it, because I feel like we always focus on the results and we never look at the context. And what Quill does is it offers that context, and it shows you that no, not all the delegates were against it. There were delegates in favor for it and fighting for it. So that was definitely something I found very interesting and something that I learned, especially working with Washington.
In your basic high school history class, normally you learn about the national fight for women's suffrage and how it was a national issue, and it was a national issue. But like in North Dakota, you see this federalist process that you wouldn't have gotten anywhere else except from the Quill Project, that the states were very much more involved in this than you would maybe originally think.
We've got time for maybe one more question, if there is one.
Thank you. Was there any variation among the states as to how delegates were chosen?
Yeah, delegates. Well, delegates. I think usually it was an election kind of situation where each county held an election, different amounts of delegates per county, and then they, after that was all decided, they would all just meet at the Capitol and delegate. I know that for the case of Wyoming, at least, 6 of the people just never showed up. They were elected, didn't show up. It's kind of. But then again, Wyoming also had a very interesting process where they kind of zoomed through their convention that seemed kind of just a loose process compared to some of the other conventions, such as Idaho, who they kept much better records. There's a lot more detail on those delegates, such as where they're from, why they were in Idaho at that time. And so it is just with what you're saying, the Quill project gives you that personality of each of these delegates, which is a really cool thing. It's not just a face and a name, but you get to understand where they're coming from, their arguments for each issue. You even you get their sense of humor in a lot of instances. It really personifies these old documents into something that's fun to read, and you get an idea of kind of like what you were saying. We learned that there are people who are arguing for these issues that we've grown up knowing, oh, this is just the way that we think about it. You get a sense of, oh, here's what the arguments were, and it's not just an argument, but it's coming from an actual person, and I think that's pretty cool.
One more.
Were any of the delegates women?
None of these states were any of the delegates women. I don't think any women were delegates until we're talking about like Alaska and Hawaii with their conventions.
You raise a good question, though, that there was a little bit of angst in the founding era, not reflected in this later era, but definitely in the founding era. Should a ratifying convention for the federal constitution, or should a state constitutional convention have a broader franchise than an ordinary election? So for on a few instances in the founding era, you actually find a broader franchise for these foundational questions than later. But that's not a sort of angst that was reflected in this era. I think the elections for the conventions followed what the territory normally did. I think we're dead on time.
All right. Thank you for thanking our panelists. Just a quick note here about process. I realize we're going to be unveiling what these students have done over the next 2 days, but we selected the 5 states for this grant because they were Western states. There was geographical proximity, but also temporal proximity. All 5 of these conventions, there are actually 6 state constitutional conventions that started on July 4th, 1889. Montana is not represented in our grant because they went and got themselves a new constitution in 1972, and so we're focusing on those constitutions that are still in effect today. Also, I introduced Dr. Cole, but I failed to introduce our student panelists, and so I'm just going to very quickly let you know who you've been hearing from. Starting on the far end, Liné Fourie is a senior in political science from South Africa. Grace Yeager is a junior in social studies education from Texas. And Joseph Stanley is graduated a year ago and is now working in Washington, D.C. in policy world, but I think has graduate. So for all of our professors here today, you have a great candidate for your programs in Joseph Stanley and actually in all of our students here. So thanks, everyone. We're taking a break. We will be back. Let me make sure I get the time right here. Our session 3 will convene in this room at 1:30. For those of you who are presenters, you can head next door right now, and we'll see everyone else at 1:30. Thanks very much.